Bonjour and welcome back. In the last lecture, we explored the political and economic life of the 1930s, focusing on the outsized personality of the president at the time, Franklin D. Roosevelt. Today, we will explore the same decade, but by looking at other people, especially on the left. Some decades are more conservative, others are more liberal. The 1930s were definitely on the liberal side. Let's start with this lady. Her name was Eleanor Roosevelt, and the last name should sound familiar. Yes, she was the wife of Franklin D. Roosevelt. In fact, she was born Eleanor Roosevelt as well, because she also happened to be the niece of the previous president, Theodore Roosevelt, as well as the wife and then a distant cousin of Franklin D. Roosevelt. So in terms of her background, well, the same story that I already told you twice for Theodore and Franklin. It's the same rich family from New York. So in her case, being wealthy did not help too much because her father, who was the brother of Teddy Roosevelt, was a drunk, and so she had a terrible childhood. Plenty of money for sure, but the one thing that she did not have was parental love. In fact, she spent quite a bit of her childhood living in boarding houses and fancy schools in Switzerland and such, lacking the one thing that she wanted, a nice hug from Papa and Mama. Also, she happened to be not the prettiest of the bunch. You look at photos of her and she seems perfectly normal, but she was considered kind of ugly by the standards of her time. Homely is how they refer to her. And she was also a smart person, very active, and she didn't want to be the pretty wallflower, the kind of expectation that was for women of her class. So she did not fit quite right. Ultimately, she did find her prince charming, and that would be Franklin D. Roosevelt, her distant cousin. But even then, their marriage was a complicated affair. Her husband got very sick with polio in the 1920s, and he had an affair with her secretary, and he had more affairs after that. And ultimately, in response, she had affairs of her own, including a lesbian relationship. So their marriage was a kind of a complicated thing. They did not get divorced because in the 1930s, people of their milieu did not get divorces. Instead, their marriage became more of an alliance of convenience, that both of them respected the other, shared similar political beliefs, probably cared for each other, but did not have a traditional marriage in that sense. In many ways, she reminds me of Hillary Clinton and her marriage to Bill Clinton in a more recent past. So in 1932, when Roosevelt was elected, she became the First Lady, and she was the longest serving First Lady in US history. The role of First Ladies back then was kind of limited. You just smiled for the photograph and you redecorated the White House. And she would not redecorate the White House because she had no taste for interior design. On top of that, this was the Great Depression. Most Americans were hurting, and she thought it would be a bad idea to spend a fortune on getting new carpet when the old carpet from the Coolidge era was doing just fine. And people appreciated that. She was not also spending too much money on dresses and such. So she's the anti-Jackie Kennedy. She is the cheap First Lady, but cheap in a good sense, one that is frugal at a time when the whole nation is hurting. In a different era, she might have run for president. In the 1930s, that's kind of unthinkable. By this point, women had just gotten the right to vote, so the idea of a woman as president is something that would be difficult for people to appreciate. This being said, it's almost 100 years later. I'm taping this in 2019, and we still haven't had a female president today, so maybe we haven't changed that much. So what is her role? Well, she's acting as what's called the eyes and the ears of the president, kind of her special envoy. Franklin Roosevelt, being a president, was pretty much stuck in Washington, D.C., especially since he was disabled, so traveling was always a struggle for him. And because there was no good polling data in the 30s, he had a hard time knowing what the pulse of the nation was like, and that's where she came in. She traveled a lot, often on airplanes, and that's a new industry back then, the airline industry, and we're not that far away from the early pioneers. The first flight of the Wright brothers was back in 1903. So people are kind of afraid of airplanes because they do have a tendency to crash quite often. And the fact that the First Lady was so willing to entrust her life to airplanes, and successfully so, made her kind of a poster child for the airline industry, and she helped a lot in that regard. In the meantime, she was able to go to the state of Washington, and then Texas, and then Ohio, and all over the place, and meet people from all walks of life, and then go back and report to the president on how well or poorly his policies were received. And she had a great gift for empathy. Even though she came from money, she could talk to a coal miner in West Virginia, or a sharecropper in Mississippi, or a person cutting timber in the state of Washington, and always relate to them in a way that was kind of a gift for her. She had a great social conscience, so she cared about the poor, Also people that were of different races. You'll see her in pictures going to Tuskegee Institute in Alabama, talking to black men, which would seem kind of normal today, but in Alabama in the 1930s, to be talking to a black man where your wealthy white woman was kind of a powerful symbol. And in turn, she would kind of encourage her husband to adopt a more progressive view of racial matters. You'll see her on other pictures where she's visiting camps for internment camps for Japanese Americans in the 1940s, and kind of commiserating on the fact that they are being stuck there just for the fact that they are of Asian descent. And who put them there? Her husband. So that must have made for some interesting conversation that night when she came back home. She also had a lot of people who wrote to her, and that's something that people do a lot in the 1930s. They establish a special rapport with a person, in that case Eleanor Roosevelt, and they'll write to her when there's a problem. And she had received something like 100,000 letters a year, and she had a team of secretaries to write them. And those letters have been published now, and they're kind of interesting because you can see the special connection that she had made with many people. I remember reading a letter from a young black girl who wrote to the First Lady of the United States saying, I'm in high school and I would like to go to college because I have high aspirations, but my dad is only a gardener, he has no money, so I can't go to college. Can you just send me some money and help find my daddy a job? And this way I can go to college and become somebody. And it's just amazing that she could inspire people that she had never met to have big dreams, because to become a college graduate when a young black girl in the 1930s is definitely not the norm. She was also a journalist. She would write an editorial piece in the paper every day that was called My Day, which is, well, about my day. And it was a way for her to express all the things that she had done and how she met people and the kind of policies that she would embrace. And it was a way to talk indirectly to her husband and push some policies that she would want. And that had a huge circulation as well. So throughout the 1930s, she's important as kind of the right-hand man, or woman in that case, to the president. So there's a big limitation in the sense that she is not elected. She does not hold a specific office. And all she can do is advise the president, who is really the man on the job. And so she's kind of niggling him from the far left, urging him to be more progressive on racial issues, on social issues, and sometimes he listened to her, and sometimes he listened to another advisor. So that's a big limitation when you try to study her, which is a big limitation of women's history in general in the 20th century. Her proudest achievement came in 1945, meaning after her husband died. In World War II, the United Nations was created, and there was a commission put together to draft the UN Declaration of Human Rights, which would be kind of a Bill of Rights, but for the entire world. And she was put as a chairwoman of that commission, and she helped draft the UN Declaration of Human Rights. And that forever remained her proudest achievement because, well, for once, she was in charge, so it's an achievement that you can give to her credit. Moving on to another important figure of 1930s politics, we're going to talk about Father Charles Coughlin. He was not from the US originally, he came from Canada, he was an Irish Canadian, and he was a Catholic priest. Early in his career, in the 1920s, he was hired in Detroit to do a radio show that was weekly on religious matters, and he was very successful at speaking on the radio, which is a big medium of the age. And as a result, he garnered a huge audience, initially on more religious issues because he's a Catholic priest, but by 1929, when the Depression hits, and the people that are listening to him are more worried about the job than their salvation, he kind of shifted topics and got to talk more about politics, and as a result garnered a huge audience. Think of him as like the Rush Limbaugh of the time. His views are kind of controversial today because he tended to be very much against bankers, and many Americans are against bankers at that point because of the crisis in Wall Street and how many people had lost their house to foreclosure and such. But in his case, the bankers are also the Jewish bankers from New York, and it's kind of tapping on that old anti-Semitic, anti-banking tradition that we saw already in the populist era. It's kind of the same strand that's resurfacing. And there is, unfortunately, an anti-Semitic strand in some parts of the Catholic Church as well, so it's kind of building on top of that. And there's an element that's kind of ugly, and there's still a lot of anti-Semitism in the US in the 1930s. It's only after the 1940s and people discover the horrors of the Holocaust that people kind of realize that being anti-Semitic is just not acceptable. So he had quite a bit of influence, especially in the passage of some banking regulation in the 1930s. There are some laws that are passed as part of the New Deal, specifically to separate the banks that are all about lending money to customers, like consumer banks, and those that are all about investing into risky investments in Wall Street, investment banks. And because one job is more useful to the general public and the other one is much riskier, the idea would be to have two separate sets of banks. This way, if one company loses its shirt on the stock market, then this will not impact people that just had a checking account at the local bank. This act was on the books up until the 1990s. Nowadays, it is no longer on the books. And lo and behold, we had a huge financial crisis in 2008 caused by the fact that the big investment banks made some risky investments, and because now they were also commercial banks catering to customers, they had become too big to fail and had to be bailed out. That's the reason we study history, because we want to learn from the mistakes of the past and not to repeat them. Some people in Congress ought to take this course. Another fascinating figure would be Francis Everett Townsend, or Doc Townsend as he was famously known, because he was a medical doctor. He came from Long Beach, California, and had a long career there as a doctor until the 1930s when the Great Depression hit, and he noticed that many of his customers or patients, that tended to be old men like himself, were suffering a lot. They could not pay the doctor visit or pay the medicine and so forth. There is no Medicare, no Medicaid back then, so people are paying out of pocket. And one day when he was in his office between two patients, he noticed outside of the window that there were two hobos walking, two old men about his age, and they clearly were not too rich. They were wearing rags and they were going through trash, and at some point opened one trash can, found some morsel of food in there, and then ate it. So he wrote a letter to the local editorial page, and it was so successful that it was picked up by other papers and eventually received some national praise. And that led to a huge national campaign to push forward the plan named after him, the Townsend Plan. This is what he had to say in that letter. He thought that there should be some kind of retirement benefit for old people. That would be set at $150 a month, which doesn't sound like much today, but is real money in the 1930s. To give you a point of comparison, about half the states in the country back then had no retirement benefit whatsoever, and those that did had an average benefit of $15 a month. So this would have been 10 times more generous. There would be requirements. One of that is that you would have to be over 60, and also that you could not put that money in a savings account. It would be more like a coupon that would expire at the end of the month, and so you would have to spend it all. This way you could prime the pump, have money circulating back into the economy, and then have more consumer purchases that would help the businesses. And then beyond that, the other requirement is that you could not be in the job market at the same time because there were too few jobs around. So if you're getting money from the government, don't go out and steal somebody else's job. Still, for most old people, it sounded good. $150 a month was a pretty good sum in the 1930s. And if you're over 60, you think, what are the requirements? I got to go shopping all the time, spend all the money, and I don't have to work for it. That sounds pretty good. So the old people set up Townsend clubs all over the country, and they were very excited about it, and they would lobby the congressmen and meet in the clubs and probably exchange pictures of their grandkids, I guess. That's what old people do. But mostly write to their congressmen and put a lot of pressure on Congress to pass the Townsend Plan. And old people vote a lot, so Congress was paying attention. Except that the Townsend Plan was too good to be true. It was quite generous. So generous, in fact, that if the Congress had funded it entirely, it would have required something like 50% of the budget of the US Congress, going just for that one retirement benefit. And so it would have required a huge amount of taxes, a doubling of taxes, just to pay that one benefit for people that would be old and not working themselves. So there was something wrong about it, financially speaking. And so when the plan came to a vote, Congress decided we can't vote for that, that's going to bankrupt the nation. On the other hand, we can't vote against it, otherwise we're going to not be reelected. So what they decided to do was to not have a roll call. And a roll call is whenever they vote on the law, normally every congressman or woman is supposed to give their name and whether they vote aye or nay. This way you can know whether your local congressman or woman is in favor or against the law. So they didn't have a roll call, so nobody knew who you were voting for. And so this way the law was defeated, but every legislator, when they came back to the district, was able to say, I was in favor of it, I was in the minority, and everybody claimed to be in the minority, even though they had voted against it. So the plan never passed. On the other hand, you see the influence that this had in the sense that it put pressure on Congress to do something about old people, and that led to the passage of the Social Security Act of 1935, which set up a retirement benefit that would be financed by payroll deductions. and would be far less generous in the sense it would only pay money after you had paid into the system for a while, in a way that was far more sustainable in the long run. In fact, it is still around. The last person we will mention today is a person from Louisiana, Huey P. Long, who came from Wynn Parish in kind of the central northern part of the state. He came from a poor background. He was supposed to be a farmer and very quickly decided that he was not going to get his hands dirty making little money working as a farmer. So instead, he got into law school. One of his early jobs when he got into politics was to be on the Public Service Commission, which doesn't sound like much. It's a commission that regulates public utilities like gas and electricity and so forth. But it has a lot of big impact on everybody's daily life because that's what decides how much your electricity bill is going to be at the end of the month. And generally, the way politics had worked in Louisiana since the days of the Civil War had been very much a good old boys club, where people tied to the elites and the big businesses would work behind closed doors to keep their entrenched interest, including setting high rates for utilities. Well, Huey Long came like the proverbial bull in the china shop and just destroyed everything and insisted on lower rates, which did not make him too many friends among the elites. On the other hand, if you're somewhere living in rural Louisiana and your water bill has gone down this month, you know who to thank for, and that would be Huey Long. So later on, he ran for governor in 1928 and was elected successfully as a candidate of the poor. He was a Democrat, but in his case, more of a populist Democrat, one that would defend the common man against the big entrenched interest. When he was elected, he became a nationwide figure known not just in Louisiana, but around the country. And views of him were kind of divided. Some people looked at him as being a complete clown, that funny guy from Louisiana. John Dos Passos, a novelist from the time, described him as a little boy with very bad manners. Also, he liked to call himself the kingfish, the biggest fish in the pond, and all that sounded ridiculous. And indeed, you have several anecdotes about his life that are kind of ridiculous. At some point, he was partying in New Orleans, as he liked to do, and on Sunday morning, the consul from Germany happened to be in town, so he was told to go and meet him as governor of the state, and he had partied too much, so he showed up late in his pajamas still. And German ambassadors don't do humor too well, so they didn't take it too well. Or there's another case where he has a big debate with Franklin D. Roosevelt on what to do with the remnant from the soup that you made when you've like stewed vegetables and such. Specifically, if you have cornbread, do you dunk the cornbread into that soup or do you crumble the cornbread into it? And apparently Franklin D. Roosevelt had said that he liked to crumble his cornbread, which meant that Huey Long, who didn't like Roosevelt, was a dunker, and they had a long debate over whether to dunk or crumble your cornbread, which didn't sound too serious in the midst of the Great Depression. So that's one view that people have of him, that stupid, silly governor of Louisiana. Some other people look at him in a different way that is far more ominous, that he might be the American equivalent to the fascist dictators that you have in Italy, Mussolini, or in Germany, Hitler. That is the way that he is depicted in many ways in the novel by Robert Penn Warren, All the King's Men, which won the Pulitzer Prize for Best Novel right after World War II. And it was also turned into a movie after that, which won a number of Academy Awards. And far more recently, about 10 years ago, into another movie, which in that case was not that good. Or you have that novel by Sinclair Lewis, It Can't Happen Here, which is about what would happen if a fascist dictator was elected president of the United States. In many ways, the person in that novel is based directly on Huey Long. At some point where New Orleans is getting a bit too restless, he declared martial law there. Or during a campaign, some journalists announced that they had revelations to be made about the finances, about his campaign, and somehow the journalists disappeared for a few months. They were kidnapped so that they would not speak during the re-election campaign. Or if you're an employee of the state of Louisiana, your job relied on Huey Long because he changed the law so that he would appoint every single person in Louisiana down to the lowest janitor at the local school. This way, everybody would have to be 100% for Huey Long, otherwise they would lose their job. And if you were an employee, there would be a special deduction in your salary, which is going straight into the re-election fund for the governor. So it was definitely a perversion of the way democracy is supposed to work. And that's true also in Baton Rouge, in the capital, when laws are passed. He is the one sending the text, and then the legislature is just a rubber stamp legislature. And Louisiana at that time held the record for the most laws passed, something like 20 laws in 15 minutes, and he called them dime a dozen punks that he could buy and sell like sacks of potatoes. That gives you a sense of his view of the separation of powers. And at the same time, some people look at him as the best governor ever, the only one that ever cared about him. And that's the third view of Huey Long as a progressive, one who for the first time is starting to put some real money into schools and is turning the main state university, LSU in Baton Rouge, into a premier institution, and especially the football program, because it was very big into football, would actually be on the sidelines kind of making calls instead of the coach. And then the number of roads, paved roads, go from 300 miles when he becomes governor, which is pretty much nothing, to 3,000 miles. And if you go around Louisiana on the backcountry roads, very often you'll encounter a bridge over one of the many bayous we have around here, and there's a sign on it that says built during the administration of Huey Long. And he also set up a network of charity hospitals to serve the poor, which unfortunately has been dismantled since. But there is a very progressive aspect to him, and many of his supporters were willing to forgive him for his shenanigans as long as he delivered the goods. And nowadays, you don't have to pay for textbooks for your kid if he goes to primary school or middle school because the governor has decided that Louisiana will pay for the textbooks. So he was very popular for that. Ultimately, he had a higher ambition than just being governor of Louisiana, and he wanted to go to Washington. So to be elected senator was not too hard. He was quite popular in Louisiana. Plus, remember that he appointed every public official, including the people in the Electoral Commission that would count the votes. So he was elected senator. The big fear that he had, though, is that if he left the governor's office and became senator, then he would not have access to the kind of bribery and patronage that would keep his finances afloat. So it took a while for him to find somebody to replace him that would be kind of pliant enough. Eventually, he found him in the name of O.K. Allen. That's a nice nickname for his first name, O.K. as in the next governor was one that always said O.K. The story supposedly that one day O.K. Allen was in the governor's office and a leaf blew in through the window because it was a nice fall day. It fell on the desk and O.K. Allen signed it. So with all the time they took to kind of find a replacement, Huey Long showed up pretty late in the Senate. And it was kind of a gentleman's club where you showed up, and I don't care if you're Democrat or Republican, you get along well, you go to the bar together, and it's definitely based on seniority. So if you show up as a young man on your first term, you shut up, you learn the ropes, and you pay your respect to the older people that have been there for 20 years or more. Except if you're Huey Long, because he showed up again like the bull in the china shop and he decided that he was going to have ideas about everything and break all the norms. And he actually told all the other senators that people are angry, it's a Great Depression, you're incompetent, and soon there will be a mob outside on the steps of the Senate to hang you all in a lynching mob. And when that happens, I don't know if I'll be inside to be lynched just like you are, or if I'll go outside and join the mob and kill you all. He was also known for his filibusters, which is an interesting term. Filibuster can mean many, many things. Originally, it meant a pirate. In the 19th century, it meant some kind of adventurer in the US that would go and invade places like northern Mexico and Nicaragua on their own. But by the 20th century, it meant if you go to the Senate and you start talking forever and prevent a law from coming to a vote. Because based on the rules of propriety in the Senate, whenever a senator speaks, you will never interrupt him. And so if a law came to a vote that you didn't like, but every other senator was going to go for it, just keep talking and talking and talking forever. And then ultimately the calendar just runs out of time and it's the end of the session and then the law is defeated. You have a famous scene like that in the Frank Capra movie, Mr. Smith Goes to Washington, which I highly recommend. So in his case, he had a long filibuster where he talked about why he was opposed to a single law by himself and stopped the whole Senate because of that. And then when he ran out of things to say, he read the whole Constitution and started explaining the Constitution to the other senators in case they were not aware of it, and then started taking questions from the audience and giving advice on the best Louisiana cooking. And it went on for hours and hours until he had to answer a call of nature. And the minute that he left the podium, somebody else jumped in on the podium and then ended the filibuster. So he did not even achieve that goal. So ultimately, senator was not enough either, and he wanted to be president and would have run in a 36th election. And he would have run as a Democrat, just like Roosevelt, but as a more progressive one that would be in kind of the left wing of the party. And his program was called Share the Wealth, also known as Every Man a King, which is the title of a song that he pushed in order to accompany his campaign. It's a great, great song. Just go on YouTube and get a recording of the governor of Louisiana singing Every Man a King. And as you do so, you might also check out the song You Are My Sunshine, because this one was written by another governor of Louisiana. The program itself is pretty simple. It's kind of Robin Hood. You tax the rich, and there would be a limit to how much money you could make in America. And if you earn more than so many dollars per year, then that money would be confiscated by the government and then donated to the poor, because you could not earn less than a significant amount. So no matter what happened to you, you would have a minimal amount of yearly income guaranteed by the government, which would be enough to lead a nice middle-class life with a house of your own and enough to put food on the table. He was so brash and confident about his success that he actually wrote an autobiography about his role as president. It's called My First Days in the White House. And you heard correctly. It's about his life as a president, but it's written before he ever became president. As it turned out, he was never elected president in 1936. In fact, never had a chance to run, because in 1935, while he was back in Baton Rouge to check on how the governor of the state was doing in his absence, he was shot by a doctor called Carl Weiss, who was from one of the many families that had been injured personally by his policies. And if you ever visit the Capitol in Baton Rouge, which obviously was built during the time of Huey Long, go to the backside of the main hall and you'll see the spot where he was shot, and you even can find some impact in the wall. So after that, he was sent to a big funeral in Louisiana, and all over the country you have millions of people that wept that day, either because they thought they had lost somebody who would have been the greatest president ever, or because they never got a chance to shoot the bastard by themselves. People's views on Huey Long were quite split. Well, that's it for our exploration of the politics of the 1930s, which are quite liberal compared with the rest of the 20th century in America. The next section will take us overseas again, because throughout the 40s, 50s, and 60s, the US was involved in World War II, and then the Cold War, and the Korean War. Au revoir. See you next time.